This is another MetaTalk.
Tonight I want to talk to you about the metamorphic zone and why I want to start a restaurant without food. And for you to understand why I would want to start a restaurant without food, I want to talk to you about two different ideas or two different ways of thinking. First of all, there's directional thinking, which is the traditional way that most people think in life. And so directional thinking is where we know where it's going. That's why it's called directional, and people can follow it quite easily. In business, it's the way we improve a product. In church, it's when we make the church be a little bit better. The youth group grows, we have a new program, whatever our field, it's where we improve things. But at Metamorphic, we actually don't want to focus our lives on directional thinking, because I think the days of directional thinking are actually dead. In fact, we live in a world that we call intersectional thinking, thus the picture of an intersection right there. Intersectional thinking is where we change the world and we shift the worldview and the way that people think and create values in their life. It's a place of fascination, it's a place of courage, it's a place of fun. It's a place where the world is transformed and turned upside down. It's a place, if you like, of disruption, a place where we disrupt technology, we disrupt the way people think, we disrupt the way that people do life, just simply because we can and because we need to be brave in the face of a new world. And you might sort of think, well, what's that got to do with anything, and how does that relate to me? Well, if we want to solve poverty in the world, we've got to not have directional thinking, but we've got to meet in the intersection. Because clearly the ideas of the past have not changed the world that we live in. If we want to build new big corporations, we can't copy the past. What we've got to do is go straight to the intersection and begin to think differently. And so what this means is that we need to not be focused on one discipline. And so I think about this in terms of the discoveries of the past. If you think back 200 or 300 years ago, you could be in one discipline and come up with a major discovery. But how many people know that we're never going to rediscover something like gravity? It's already been discovered. How many people know we're not going to rediscover Australia? It's already been discovered 3 times. First of all by Indigenous Australians, then by some Dutch people that didn't see the value in the most beautiful and wonderful nation in the whole world. And then, of course, the Brits come and rescued us, and here we are today. But the truth of the matter is, the future doesn't belong to a single discipline. It's actually about where we create an intersection of people that think differently, a melting pot of cultures to bring out the newness of the world that we live in. And the way that I look at this, or probably the best example from history, is 15th century Florence and what we know or call the Renaissance. And the Renaissance was an amazing place because it was a melting pot of people from different cultural backgrounds who were artists, poets, scientists, there were financiers, there were all sorts of amazing different people who came to Florence with one purpose in mind. And that was to exchange thought, to learn from each other, and to change the world that we live in. And tonight, I guess what I'm wanting to talk to you about, just for a couple of moments, is how do we change the world? Do we do it by completely doing the things we've done in the past and repeating history with directional thought? Or do we come to the intersection and come to that place of creative genius where we do something for the first time? And so in Florence, they did change the world, and they changed the way that people thought. And I find that really interesting because it became the epicenter of an explosion that changed the style of leadership in the world. It was the greatest explosion of innovation and creativity that we've ever seen. But how does this relate to you and I today in the leadership vacuum as we try and change the world that we live in? Well, I want to say that if we want to be great leaders today, we need to lead with the sound of Shakira, but also with the emotions of Shrek. And the reason I say that is simply this, because these two characters were birthed out of an intersection. For those that know anything about Shakira, she's a Colombian girl from South America, and of course, as a pop star, you would have predicted with a directional way of thinking that she would have come out with Latino music. But Shakira didn't launch with Latino music. Shakira came up with a music that had never been heard before in the history of the world, as she fused together Arabic music, Latino music, and then superimposed it over Western pop culture to go straight to the top of the charts when she first launched her career. And of course, fusion music was birthed, and now we have it all over the place. Well, equally so, Shrek is another example of the intersection, because Shrek is an ogre. But the people from DreamWorks in their creative genius realized that they wanted to not give us an ogre that was predictable, that they wanted to create an intersection of disciplines. So they chose an ogre that should be angry, an ogre that should be grumpy, an ogre that should be aggressive and violent, and put this persona on him of being malleable and lovely and kind and all of this. And that is what we call the intersection, which reminds me of a story, actually, of three men that went to heaven. And they got to heaven and they died. That's why they were there. And when they got there, St. Peter met them at the gates because he's the gatekeeper. And he said these words. He said, listen, we're a bit full in heaven at the moment. And we can only allow people in that have really had some amazing death. Well, you've got to give us an amazing death story. Otherwise, you'll have to be in this holding pattern outside here. And so he says to the first guy, so how did you die? And he says, well, it's an interesting story because I suspected that my wife was having an affair. And so I went home early from work and I burst into the apartment on the 14th story of our high-rise, and there I saw the perpetrator. I saw him hanging from the balcony by his hands as he tried to hide from me. So I ran through the apartment and I stood on his hands and I kicked his hands until he fell. And he fell 14 stories down and he landed in a tree. And I was so frustrated because the tree saved his fall and he was still alive. So I looked for something that was heavy so I could throw it on him, and all I could find was a fridge. And so I picked up the refrigerator and I threw it over the balcony and it landed on his head and killed him. And he said, but in the midst of that and all that excitement, I had a heart attack and dropped dead myself, and that's how I got here. And so Peter goes, that's an amazing story. You can come in. And so he was allowed into heaven. He says to the second guy, he says, so how did you die? He goes, well, you won't believe this. I was on the 15th floor of an apartment block. And I was there washing my windows, minding my own business, when I slipped off the balcony. But fortunately, I was able to grab hold of the balcony below me on the 14th floor. And I saw this man running towards me. I knew he was going to save me, but he didn't. He stood on my hands. He kicked my hands. And the next minute I fell, but then it was my lucky day. I landed in a tree and I'm there. I'm saying, man, I'm so lucky. Until I looked up and I saw a random refrigerator falling from the sky and it killed me. And he says, you're welcome to come here. That's an amazing story. Then he says to the third guy, he says, so how did you die? He says, you won't believe this story, but I was naked hiding inside a refrigerator. And the story, of course, shows us the difference between directional and intersectional. Because as I told you about the first two people, you knew the direction. You were telling the story before we even got there. You were saying, oh, that poor lady, that poor man, she wasn't even having an affair. But the moment we got to the refrigerator, of course, everything changed. Because directional thought said that there was food in the refrigerator, that there was beers in the refrigerator. None of us expected to find a naked man in that refrigerator. And so that's the difference between directional and intersectional thought thinks. But a lot of this is based on assumptions. And so if we want to be great leaders, we've got to learn the skill to reverse assumptions. And reversing assumptions becomes incredibly important to everything that we do. And so when I think about that, that means that we need to look at some of the business ideas that maybe could be different. So, for example, I started by saying, why not have a restaurant without food? Well, some people would look at me and think I was crazy, but that's because you assume restaurants should have food. But what about if I started a restaurant where you could bring your own food and the chef would cook it up for you and make an amazing concoction? What a different way of thinking. Or imagine a restaurant where you turned up and there was no chef, there was no food, it was just an environment where you could enjoy your friends with your fish and chips or your picnic basket. Well, another example of this, of course, is one of my favourite sports in snowboarding. And of course, there it was called snurfing back in the early days. And of course, how many people know that snowboarding is not a take on skiing, it's a totally different concept. And back in 1965, when this was first birthed and the first ever commercial boards were made, everybody thought it wouldn't work, but I just came back from Queenstown in New Zealand, and I can tell you that half the people on that mountain were on snowboards. That was an intersectional thought. And the reason I say this is if we want to change the world, we can't keep thinking the things we've been thinking, but we've got to step into the intersection and say, you know what, I'm going to think a different way. I'm going to put aside my assumptions. It also means sometimes we need to break free of the networks that are solo, the networks that are sort of contained in the area, the field that we might be involved in, because those networks put a lid on our lives. Those networks don't give us permission to break out and dream and think on a bigger level. And so if we want to become world changers, we need to reverse our assumptions and break free of networks. And when you can do that, you'll be in a position to change the world, to change poverty, to change the situation in Africa where children are starving, to start a restaurant without food, or to maybe be a leader that doesn't have to get people to do what they want them to do, but maybe to look at leadership differently, where we can actually empower other people to do what they want to do. That is what I believe is a radical thought that's not really so radical, but I believe it's the way of the future. If we want to change this world, we need to think differently and enter into the intersection as we move forward. I want to thank you for being part of the Metamorphic Zone, where we laugh at the impossible and then we do it. Thank you.
This has been another Metamorphic production.